Hey guys, Mr. Hyatt here. This is the APES Chapter 5 lecture over species interactions, ecological succession, and population control. For the most part, we're going to skip species interactions as part of this flip because I've already talked through those as part of the mini notes that we did on September 1st. So make sure you look back at those and you're comfortable with all the symbiotic relationships as well as predator-prey. And all those types of things. So we start, as we always do, with our textbook with a case study. We're looking at the southern sea otter. This case study really shows us the importance of a keystone species. You see that there was an estimated 16,000 sea otters living off the coast of California. By 1938, we were down to about 50 left. About 40 years later, they were declared an endangered species, and they've since recovered. Excuse me. So what we've seen is as those numbers have started to climb, the ecosystem as a whole is improving. So you see there it protects kelp by limiting sea urchin populations. It basically, as a keystone species goes away, the food web is disrupted. That keystone species starts to reemerge and the food web starts to stabilize. So how do humans interact with other species both positively and negatively? Well, we mostly caused this phenomenon where most of them are gone. Then we positively impact those species by undoing the negative things that we've done. And that's going to be a trend throughout this whole course. Most of the positive things that we do for the environment, they aren't really that positive. It's just a matter of undoing mistakes that we've made in the past. So 5.1 is about those species interactions that we talked about. Left this slide in this notes presentation just to remember to talk about it. So there are 5 ways that species interact. Make sure you understand all of these. Like I said, most of these we've already gone through. We did not talk about competition in the mini notes. There are 2 types of competition that we need to consider. Number 1 is intra-specific. So members of the same species are racing for food, water, shelter. That may sound like the Oh Deer Lab. And then we also have interspecific competition where different species are fighting for resources. That's where we get niche overlap. That's where we get competition. That's where we could eventually see extinction if one species outcompetes the other. One strategy that species use or implement, however you want to say that, to prevent extinction is resource partitioning. I got a picture that I think will make this make sense, but basically it's like we saw in the last chapter with the seabirds and their feeding niches. They eat in different portions of the beach, so they're not competing for the same food. Another example of that is all these warblers. I really struggle to pronounce the word warbler, so sorry it sounds so weird. But what you're seeing in the yellow are their feeding ranges. So each of these individual species of warbler eats in a different part of the tree. So the Blackburnian warbler isn't competing with the black-throated green warbler, and we're reducing competition. Now, is there some overlap? For sure there's some overlap. There's going to be a little bit of competition, but these species of warblers have basically divided up where they're going to spend their feeding time excuse me, in these spruce trees. And your book mentions the fact that these zones, certainly this Blackburnian warbler is going to go in the green area, but what we've noticed is that these species spend at least half their time in this zone. So most of their time, they're going to be in their zone. Sometimes they're going to go out and grab food if it's available. But for the most part, they stay in their zone. Don't forget about the information from the mini notes, kind of have already covered that. So 5.2 is all about how ecosystems respond to change. You studied succession as freshmen. Not a lot more depth in terms of succession in this course, but we just need to make sure we refresh our memories, we knock the cobwebs loose a little bit. When you hear succession, think like not success like winning, but succession like who takes over for who, as in President Bush succeeded President Clinton, who was then succeeded by President Obama, who was succeeded by President Trump. We know about the British line of succession, who takes over for who. So in terms of ecological succession, we're talking about how the ecosystem develops. In the case of primary succession, we're talking about how an ecosystem establishes life for the first time. It takes hundreds of thousands of years because we have to create soil before we can settle with any sort of upper level plants or anything like that. So that process takes a long, long time. Let me go back and make sure I didn't skip anything here. We've got examples of fires, volcanic eruptions, climate change, and clear cutting. Those would all be examples of secondary succession. That's where we've got an established ecosystem. There's some sort of traumatic event, and the ecosystem comes back. Primary succession, we're talking about an area where there's never been life before, or life has been completely reset. Sometimes volcanic eruptions fall under those. Sometimes it could be something like we pave a parking lot. We've got a surface where there's never been life before. Over time, as that parking lot begins to decay, we're going to see the process of primary succession. We're starting with exposed rock. We're going to get some sort of basic photosynthesizer like lichens and mosses. They're going to live and die and break down the rocks. Their nutrients are going to get cycled into the soil, and then the soil is going to be more fertile, so more advanced herbs and shrubs and things like that can move in. But we're not talking trees. Baby steps. We've got more photosynthesizers here that are going to live and die and be cycled into the soil. Then we're going to get some bigger bushes and things along those lines, and eventually we'll get trees, and eventually we'll get large trees, and we'll get then consumers coming into the area. Excuse me. Secondary succession is really similar, but it's a lot faster because we don't lose soil. Think of a forest fire. Forest burns down, but there's still nutrients in the soil. Often, in that case, the soil is more nutrient rich because the nutrients from the fire, from the trees, have now been returned to the soil. Like it says at the bottom of the screen there, it doesn't always follow a predictable path as neatly as primary succession does, because we're going to be dependent upon what nutrients are left in the soil. This is a new layer that you didn't probably talk about as freshmen, and that's that secondary succession is going to enhance sustainability because it's going to make food webs more complex. We're going to have a bunch of decomposers once all the traumatic event ends. Enhances energy flow, again, because we're going to have just a rush of decomposers and consumers flocking to an area where there's a whole bunch of nutrients now available. And it's going to increase nutrient cycling, again, because all those nutrients that were held in big reservoirs like trees are going to be returned to the soil. Here's the picture. Really similar, but we never have our exposed rock, so the process takes significantly less time. So one of the things that we need to keep in mind in terms of our positive and negative feedback is that these living systems are sustained through constant change. There's constantly change. So we're not necessarily specifically talking about climate change. Maybe we're talking about seasonal changes. Maybe we're talking about migration patterns, things like that. There's always going to be change. There's always positive feedback and negative feedback. There are two vocab words that we need to make sure we define here: inertia and resilience. So inertia is the ability to survive a moderate disturbance. So the idea of inertia is you've got momentum moving in one direction. That kind of applies here. You've got your inertia is going to be your ability to maintain that forward motion in light of a moderate disturbance. So if there's a flood, is the entire ecosystem going to collapse? Well, if you have low inertia, yes. If you have high inertia, no. The ecosystem is going to survive that flood and recover and be fine. So sorry. Resilience is going to be the ability of the ecosystem to be restored after the disturbance. So again, if we've got high resilience, flood goes through and wipes out a major part of the ecosystem, how quickly can it come back? That's the idea of resilience. 5.3 is really talking about populations and limiting factors. You should remember those from Biology 1, and we definitely talked about them in our Oh Dear lab. So populations grow, shrink, or remain stable based on a couple of things. How many organisms are being born, how many are dying. Obviously, if more are being born than die, population's growing. If they're equal, population's stable. If more are dying than are being born, population is dropping. Then, of course, immigration and emigration are going to impact our population size. Now, you don't really say this word immigration. I just say it that way so that students can tell what I'm trying to say. It's really emigration. We need to be comfortable with age structure diagrams. I've got a lab that we might get time to work through. That's kind of a paper lab that there's not a lot of doing stuff. But basically, an age structure diagram, we're going to break populations into 3 groups: pre-reproductive, reproductive, and post-reproductive. Because those groups are going to tell us, do we have a huge pre-productive group, in which case our population is about to explode? Do we have a huge group of reproductive people, reproductive aged people, or reproductive age organisms? Because again, the population is probably exploding now. If we have a huge population of post-reproductive organisms, then the population is probably shrinking. Or if we're talking about humans, we've got a whole bunch of old people that are soon going to need insurance. They're soon going to be leaving the workforce, things along those lines. So each population and ecosystem has a range of tolerance. Think of like where the organism can live. Let me talk from the picture. So what you're looking at is where this species of trout can survive and where they thrive. So it's sort of like humans can survive in Alaska, but we don't thrive there. We thrive in warmer climates. Our health is better. Our mental health is better. We fit that ecosystem better than we do the tundra. So where we see a lot of organisms, that's their optimum range. There's a zone where we can survive, but we're stressed. We're physiologically stressed. So that would be like Alaska, whereas Antarctica, we can't survive there without some huge interventions. We can't just walk outside and survive there. We have to rise above. So I'm going to leave off here, and I'll finish. Part 2 will be very short. Make sure you watch it.